The emergency room doors burst open at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. That would redefine everything two strangers thought they knew about trust, survival, and the razor-thin line between salvation and destruction. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen it all in her 8 years at Chicago General, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when a man covered in someone else's blood would stumble through those doors, and her split-second decision would either save 2 lives or destroy them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her stethoscope for what felt like the 100th time that shift. The emergency room at Chicago General had been unusually quiet for a Tuesday night. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made veteran nurses exchange knowing glances and brace for the inevitable storm. Sarah had learned to read these moments during her residency. The calm always preceded chaos in emergency medicine, like the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground starts shaking. She glanced at the clock above the nurse's station. 2:45 a.m. In 2 minutes. Her prediction would prove devastatingly accurate. The young doctor had built her reputation on being unshakable. At 29, she was already being courted by prestigious hospitals across the country. But something kept her anchored to this inner-city emergency room where gunshot wounds arrived alongside heart attacks, where domestic violence cases sat next to car accident victims, where every decision carried the weight of life and death. Her colleagues often joked that she had ice water in her veins, but the truth was more complicated. Sarah had learned early in her career that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when a child's life hung in the balance. Not when split seconds determined whether someone went home to their family or became another statistic. The automatic doors exploded open with such force that the security guard, Marcus, nearly dropped his coffee. What stumbled through those doors defied every protocol Sarah had memorized, every emergency scenario she'd drilled, every assumption she'd made about her ability to read people in crisis. The man was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair matted against his skull and clothes that told a story of violence. His gray t-shirt was soaked through with blood, not his own. Sarah's trained eye immediately assessed, and his jeans were torn at the knees, revealing scraped skin beneath. But it wasn't his appearance that made every person in that emergency room freeze-out. It was his eyes. They weren't the wild, unfocused eyes of someone in shock or the desperate plea of someone seeking help. These were the calculating, hyper-aware eyes of someone who had been running, someone who was still running, someone who knew that death was closer than the next heartbeat. "I need a doctor," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos written across his body. "Someone's dying." Sarah stepped forward instinctively, her medical training overriding every survival instinct that screamed at her to call security. "Sir, you need to calm down and tell me what happened. Are you injured?" That's when she saw it, the slight bulge beneath his blood-stained shirt, the way his right hand never moved far from his waistband, the methodical way his eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. Every detail painted a picture that Sarah's logical mind rejected, but her intuition accepted with crystalline clarity. This man was dangerous. "The blood isn't mine," he said, taking a step closer to where she stood. "But if you don't listen to me right now, if you don't do exactly what I tell you, it's going to be yours." The emergency room went silent except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Sarah felt every eye in the room focused on this moment, this decision that would cascade into consequences she couldn't yet imagine. Marcus, the security guard, had his hand hovering near his radio, waiting for her signal. Nurse Patricia Williams, who had worked emergency rooms for 23 years and had seen everything from drug dealers to domestic abusers walk through those doors, stood frozen behind the intake desk. Even the patient in bed 3, a homeless man named Eddie who came in monthly for his medication, had gone completely still. "Don't come any closer," Sarah warned, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. Her hand moved slowly toward the panic button mounted beneath the nurse's station counter. One press would flood the emergency room with security and police. Within 90 seconds, the man's eyes followed her movement with the precision of someone accustomed to reading body language, to recognizing threats before they materialized. A smile played at the corner of his mouth, not cruel, not menacing, but something far more unsettling, understanding. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent ice through her veins. "You have a choice to make right now. You can press that button and watch someone die, or you can trust me for the next 5 minutes and save a life. But you need to decide now." The sirens were getting closer. Sarah could hear at least 3 different emergency vehicles converging on their location. Whatever had happened, whatever had brought this man to her emergency room covered in someone else's blood, it was big enough to mobilize half the city's first responders. "How do you know my name?" she asked, buying time while her mind raced through possibilities. Had he been a patient before? Was this some kind of delayed revenge for a medical decision gone wrong? Had she treated someone he loved who didn't make it? "Because I've been watching this hospital for 3 days, he admitted with an honesty that somehow made everything worse. "I know that you work the Tuesday overnight shift. I know that you drive a blue Honda Civic that's parked in space 27. In the employee lot. I know that you live alone in an apartment on Maple Street, and that you haven't been home in 18 hours because you covered Dr. Peterson's shift when his daughter got sick." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as it hovered near the panic button. This level of surveillance wasn't random. This was planned, calculated, purposeful. "What do you want?" "I want you to save someone's life," he said. And for the first time since he'd walked through those doors, his voice carried something other than controlled threat. Desperation. "There's a woman 3 blocks from here who's bleeding out from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. She's got maybe 10 minutes before she goes into hypovolemic shock and dies. The ambulance that's supposed to get her isn't coming because they think she's already dead." "Then call another ambulance," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. "I can't." His jaw tightened. "Because the people who shot her are monitoring emergency frequencies. Because she's hiding in a place where ambulances can't reach her. Because if anyone official shows up, they'll finish what they started." The sirens had reached the hospital parking lot. Through the emergency room windows, Sarah could see the flash of red and blue lights painting the walls in alternating colors. Police cars, at least 4 of them, were surrounding the building. "So you came here," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn with horrifying clarity. "You came here to force a doctor to leave the hospital and treat someone off the books." "I came here because you're the only doctor in this city who might actually do it," he corrected. "Because 6 months ago, you left this hospital in the middle of your shift to treat a homeless man who'd been stabbed in an alley. Because you didn't ask questions when that pregnant teenager came in with cigarette burns on her arms. Because you're the only doctor I've found who puts saving lives above following rules." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was right about the homeless man, Thomas Rodriguez, who'd been too afraid of deportation to seek help and would have bled to death if she hadn't violated hospital policy to treat him in that alley behind the Greyhound station. She was right about the teenager too, Melissa Chun, whose stepfather had been burning her with cigarettes for months, who'd begged Sarah not to call social services because she had younger siblings at home. Both cases had resulted in formal reprimands in her personnel file. Both cases had also resulted in saved lives. "You've done your research," she admitted. "I've done more than research," he said, and pulled something from his back pocket that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a photograph, printed on regular copy paper, but clear enough to identify every face. The image showed her walking out of her apartment building that morning, coffee in one hand, medical bag in the other, completely unaware that someone was documenting her every move. This isn't just about the woman who's bleeding out, Sarah realized with growing horror. This is about me. You didn't choose this hospital randomly. You chose me specifically. I chose you because you're the only doctor in this city who might understand what it means to have someone's life depend on a choice that goes against everything you've been trained to do, he said. The police sirens had gone silent outside, which somehow made everything more ominous. And because right now, you're the only person who can save someone I care about more than my own life. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. For the first time since he'd walked through those doors, Sarah saw past the calculated threat to something more human underneath. This wasn't a random act of violence or desperation. This was love, twisted by circumstances into something dangerous. The woman who's bleeding, Sarah said. Who is she? His composure cracked, just for a moment, and she saw the terror he'd been hiding behind control and surveillance and carefully planned intimidation. She's my sister. The emergency room doors burst open again, but this time it wasn't another crisis stumbling through. It was Detective James Sullivan, his service weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor, followed by 4 patrol officers who immediately began positioning themselves around the room's perimeter. Chicago PD, Detective Sullivan announced, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the force. Everyone stay exactly where you are. Sarah's hand was still hovering near the panic button, but suddenly pressing, it seemed like the least important thing in the world. The police were already here, which meant whatever this man had done, whatever circumstances had led him to this emergency room covered in blood, the official response was already in motion. Ma'am, are you Dr. Sarah Mitchell? Detective Sullivan asked, though his eyes never left the blood-stained man who stood between Sarah and the exit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yes, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I need you to step away from that individual and move toward me slowly. Sarah looked at the man who had turned her routine Tuesday night into something that felt like the edge of a cliff. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that changed everything. He wasn't looking at her like a threat anymore. He was looking at her like she was his last hope. Detective, the man said, raising his hand slowly but keeping his eyes locked on Sarah's. My name is David Chen. There's been a misunderstanding. Chun. Sarah's mind raced back through her patient files, searching for the connection she knew had to be there. Chun. Melissa Chun, the pregnant teenager with cigarette burns, the one who'd begged her not to call social services, the one whose case had earned Sarah a formal reprimand for bending hospital protocols. You're Melissa's brother, Sarah said, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. I'm Melissa's brother, David confirmed. And she's dying 3 blocks from here while we're wasting time with introductions. Detective Sullivan kept his weapon lowered but ready. Mr. Chun, you're wanted in connection with a shooting that took place approximately 45 minutes ago on the south side. You need to come with us. A shooting where my sister was the victim, not the perpetrator, David shot back, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. A shooting that your department isn't investigating because they've already decided she's just another gang casualty. Step away from Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Chun, now. David took a step backward, but instead of moving toward the police, he moved deeper into the emergency room. Dr. Mitchell, you treated my sister 6 months ago. You saved her life then, and you're the only person who can save her life now. Sarah's mind was reeling with implications and connections, but one fact stood out above all others. If Melissa Chun really was bleeding out somewhere, every second they spent in this standoff brought her closer to death. Detective Sullivan, Sarah said, making a decision that would change everything. I need to know, is there an active ambulance dispatch for a gunshot victim on the south side? The detective's hesitation was answer enough. There was, he admitted. But the victim was pronounced dead at the scene. Ambulance was canceled. She's not dead, David said, his voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation. She's hiding in the basement of the old Rodriguez Market on 5th Street, because the people who shot her are still looking for her. She's alive, but she won't be much longer. Sarah looked around the emergency room that had been her world for 8 years. At Marcus, the security guard who'd become like a father figure. At Patricia, whose experience and wisdom had guided her through countless crises. At the patients who trusted her to make the right decisions under impossible circumstances. Then she looked at David Chun, whose sister had sat in this same emergency room 6 months ago, terrified and pregnant and covered in burns, begging for help that went beyond medical treatment. "Don't come any closer," she had warned him when he'd first approached. But now, as sirens wailed in the distance and police officers positioned themselves around a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control, Sarah realized that David Chun's next step wouldn't just change both of their lives. It would define who she really was as a doctor, as a human being, and as someone who had sworn an oath to first do no harm. The clock on the wall read 2:52 a.m. 5 minutes had passed since David Chun had walked through those emergency room doors, and already nothing would ever be the same. The standoff in the wood emergency room stretched into seconds that felt like hours. Sarah's medical training warred with every logical thought screaming at her to step away from David Chun, to let the police handle whatever the situation had become. But Melissa's face kept flashing in her memory. Young, terrified, pregnant, covered in burns that spoke of months of systematic abuse. Detective Sullivan's radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. "Unit 47 to Detective Sullivan. We've got movement at the Rodriguez Market. Looks like someone's been squatting in the basement. No visual confirmation on occupants, but there's definitely activity." David's face went white. "They found her," he whispered. "If your people go in there with lights and sirens, whoever shot her will know exactly where she is." "Mr. Chun," Detective Sullivan said, his voice taking on a more negotiable tone, "if your sister is really in that building, the best thing we can do is get her proper medical attention. Let us handle this." Sarah watched David's reaction carefully. The controlled facade he'd maintained since walking through those doors was cracking, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. This wasn't the calculated threat she'd initially perceived. This was a man watching his sister die while bureaucracy and procedure consumed precious minutes. "You don't understand," David said, his hands shaking now. "The people who shot Melissa aren't random gang members. They're connected. They have people inside the department, inside the hospital system. If she gets processed through official channels, she'll never make it to surgery." Detective Sullivan's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Chun." "It's a serious situation," David shot back. 3 months ago, Melissa started working with a federal task force investigating corruption in city contracts. Construction, medical supplies, equipment purchases, millions of dollars being funneled through fake companies. She was supposed to testify next week. Sarah's breath caught. This wasn't about gang violence or random crime. This was about someone trying to silence a federal witness. And Melissa Chun was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than anyone in this room had realized. "If that's true," Detective Sullivan said slowly, "then why didn't the feds put her in protective custody?" David's laugh was bitter. "Because they thought she was safe. Because they thought a pregnant 19-year-old wouldn't be perceived as a threat. Because they underestimated how deep this corruption goes and how desperate these people are to keep their secrets buried." Sarah looked around the emergency room, seeing it now with new eyes. How many of the medical supply contracts had she signed off on without thinking twice? How many pieces of equipment, how many pharmaceutical orders, How many seemingly routine transactions might have been part of whatever web Melissa had uncovered? "Dr. Mitchell," David said, turning back to her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I know what I'm asking you to do goes against everything you've been trained for. I know it puts you at risk. But my sister trusted you once before, and you saved her life. She's 20 years old, she's 6 months pregnant, and she's dying while we're standing here talking about protocol." The radio crackled again. "Detective Sullivan, we've got a problem. 2 vehicles just pulled up to the Rodriguez market. Occupants unknown, but they're not waiting for backup. Moving to intercept. Damn it," David muttered. "They're going to kill her." Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She stepped toward David instead of away from him. "If I agree to help you, if I leave this hospital to treat your sister, what guarantee do I have that this isn't some elaborate trap?" "You don't," David admitted with brutal honesty. "But I can tell you this, if we don't get to her in the next 10 minutes, guarantees won't matter because she'd be dead." Detective Sullivan moved closer, his weapon still lowered, but his body language tense. "Dr. Mitchell, I can't let you leave this building with this individual. It's not safe." Sarah looked at the detective, then at David, then at the emergency room that had been her entire professional life. Every logical part of her mind was screaming that this was insane, that she was about to throw away her career and possibly her life for someone she'd met once 6 months ago. But then she remembered Melissa's words from that night. "Please don't let them send me back there. Please don't let them hurt my baby." The burns on Melissa's arms hadn't been random. They'd been systematic, methodical, designed to cause maximum pain without permanent disfigurement. Someone had been torturing her for information, and when that hadn't worked, they'd moved to more direct methods. "Detective," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. "How long would it take for an official ambulance to get to the Rodriguez market, secure the scene, and transport a critical patient back here?" Sullivan hesitated. "Under normal circumstances, 20 to 30 minutes. And how long does someone with an abdominal gunshot wound have before blood loss becomes irreversible?" The detective's silence was enough. Sarah walked to the supply closet and began pulling items that she'd need for emergency field treatment. Gauze, clotting agents, 4 fluids, pain medication, surgical instruments. Her hands moved with the efficiency of 8 years' experience, selecting only what was absolutely essential. "Dr. Mitchell," Patricia, the head nurse, spoke up for the first time. "You can't be serious about this." "I'm serious about saving someone's life," Sarah replied, stuffing supplies into a medical bag. "Everything else is secondary." David watched her preparations with something approaching disbelief. "You're actually going to do this?" "I'm going to try," Sarah said. "But we do this my way. No weapons, no threats, no more intimidation. If you want my help, you follow my rules." "Done." Detective Sullivan stepped between them. "Dr. Mitchell, I can't allow this." "It's too dangerous." "Then come with us," Sarah said simply. "Provide security while I treat the patient. Make sure everyone stays safe." The detective's radio erupted with urgent chatter. "All units, shots fired at the Rodriguez market. Repeat, shots fired. Unknown number of casualties." David's face went gray. "We're too late." "No," Sarah said firmly, slinging the medical bag over her shoulder. "We're not. Detective Sullivan, I need you to make a choice. You can arrest Mr. Chun and let his sister die, or you can help me save a federal witness who has information that could expose corruption throughout this city." Sullivan stared at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to trust someone who's wanted in connection with a shooting." "I'm asking you to trust a doctor who's sworn an oath to save lives," Sarah corrected. "The shooting happened because someone tried to kill his sister. Everything else is just the aftermath." The detective made a decision that would reshape his entire career. "Marcus," he called to the security guard, "you're in charge of the AA until we get back. Nobody leaves, nobody enters without my authorization." "Sir?" Marcus looked confused. "We're going to save a life," Sullivan said, holstering his weapon, "and maybe catch some very dangerous people in the process." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with terror as they headed toward the emergency room exit. David walked beside her, no longer the threatening stranger who'd burst through those doors, but a desperate brother willing to risk everything for family. "There's something else you need to know," David said as they approached Sullivan's patrol car. "The reason I know so much about you, the reason I was able to track your movements and schedule. I used to work for the people who want Melissa." "Dead." Sarah stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean I was part of the corruption she uncovered. Security consulting, background checks on potential threats, surveillance on people who asked too many questions. I was good at finding information that people didn't want found." The admission hung in the cold night air like a challenge. Sarah realized that trusting David Chun might be the biggest mistake of her life, or it might be the only way to save an innocent woman and her unborn child. "When did you find out your sister was investigating your employers?" she asked. 2 weeks ago, David admitted. "She called me, terrified, said she'd stumbled onto something big while doing research for her criminal justice classes. She didn't know I was involved until I showed up at her apartment, trying to convince her to stop digging." Detective Sullivan was listening to every word, his hand resting on his service weapon. "So you knew she was in danger, and you didn't warn her?" "I tried to get her to leave town," David said. "I told her to drop out of school, move somewhere safe, start over. But she wouldn't listen. She said too many people were getting hurt by what these people were doing, and she was the only one who could stop it." They reached the patrol car, and Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. The emergency room behind them was brightly lit, safe, familiar. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a choice that would define the rest of her life. "David," she said, using his name for the first time, "if your sister dies tonight, if we can't save her, what happens then?" His answer chilled her to the bone. "Then the people responsible for this will make sure that everyone who tried to help her disappears too, including you." Detective Sullivan started the engine. "Then we better make sure she doesn't die." The patrol car pulled out of the hospital parking lot at 3:08 a.m., carrying 2 people who'd sworn oaths to protect and serve, and 1 man whose loyalty had shifted from money to family in the space of 2 weeks. None of them knew that their destination, the Rodriguez Market, was already surrounded by unmarked vehicles, whose occupants had no intention of letting anyone leave alive. As they drove through the empty streets of Chicago, Sarah realized that David Chun's next step hadn't just changed both of their lives. It had set in motion a series of events that would expose corruption throughout the city's power structure, and the only way any of them would survive the night was if they could keep one pregnant 19-year-old alive long enough to tell her story. The radio crackled with updates that grew more ominous by the minute. The shots fired at the Rodriguez Market had stopped, but no officers had been able to gain entry to the building. The 2 vehicles that had arrived before the police were gone, vanished into the maze of South Side streets like they'd never been. "There, she's still alive," David said, though whether he was trying to convince them or himself wasn't clear. "If they'd found her, if they'd killed her, there would be more gunfire. She's hiding somewhere in that building, and she's waiting for help that she doesn't think is coming." Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time, running through treatment protocols for gunshot wounds, emergency surgery procedures, trauma, stabilization techniques. Everything she'd learned in medical school, everything she'd practiced in residency, every life she'd saved in 8 years of emergency medicine had led to this moment. The patrol car turned onto 5th Street, and the Rodriguez Market came into view. It was a 3-story brick building that had been abandoned for at least 2 years, its windows boarded up and its entrance chained shut. Police cars surrounded the structure, their red and blue lights painting the surrounding buildings in alternating colors. But something was wrong. "Detective," Sarah said, pointing to the police cars. "Why is nobody moving? Why aren't they trying to get inside?" Sullivan's face went grim as he realized what she'd spotted. Every patrol car was empty. Every officer who should have been coordinating. Entry to the building was simply gone. David Chun looked at the scene and understood immediately. "It's a trap," he said quietly. "They used police frequencies to lure us here. Those aren't real cops." As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the shadows around the building. Men in tactical gear, carrying weapons that definitely weren't standard police issue. At least 6 of them, maybe more, moving with the precision of people. Who'd done this before? Detective Sullivan reached for his radio to call for backup, but David caught his hand. "Don't," he whispered. "If you call this in, they'll know we're here. And Melissa's still inside that building somewhere." Sarah looked at the abandoned market, at the armed figures positioning themselves around every possible exit, at the patrol car that had become a target the moment they'd arrived. She was a doctor, trained to save lives, not trained for whatever this situation had become. But somewhere in that building was a 20-year-old pregnant woman who'd trusted her once before. And Sarah Mitchell had never walked away from someone who needed her help. "We're going in," she said, surprising everyone including herself. "Dr. Mitchell," Detective Sullivan started to protest. "We're going in," she repeated with finality. "Because if we don't, Melissa Chun dies, and everything she knows about the corruption in this city dies with her. And because sometimes doing the right thing means ignoring every rule you've ever learned about doing things safely." David Chun looked at her with something approaching awe. "You realize we might not make it out of there alive." Sarah shouldered her medical bag and checked to make sure she had everything she'd need to perform emergency surgery in less than ideal conditions. "Then we better make sure we save her life before that becomes a problem." The clock on the patrol car dashboard read 3:23 a.m. 15 minutes had passed since they'd left the hospital. And somewhere in the abandoned building ahead of them, a young woman was fighting for her life while the people who wanted her dead closed in from every direction. Detective Sullivan cut the patrol car's engine 2 blocks away from the Rodriguez market, leaving them in darkness broken only by the distant glow of streetlights. The silence that followed felt heavier than the Maya. Tension in the emergency room, weighted with the knowledge that every decision from this point forward could be their last. "There's a service alley behind the building," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Melissa mentioned it when she called me 2 weeks ago. She said if anything ever happened, if she ever needed to hide, she'd go to the old storm drain. Access in the basement. It connects to the city's underground tunnel system." Sarah adjusted her medical bag, checking once more that she had everything needed for emergency trauma surgery. "How do we get to the basement without those men seeing?" "US. We don't," Sullivan said grimly, studying the tactical positions of the armed figures through his binoculars. "At least not all of us. This is a coordinated operation. They've got every entrance covered, sight lines on all approaches, and communication equipment that looks military grade." David pulled out his phone and showed them a detailed floor plan of the Rodriguez market. "I downloaded the building schematics 3 days ago when I first started tracking Melissa's movements. There's a freight elevator shaft that runs from the basement to the roof, but it's been out of service for years. If we can get to the 2nd floor, we might be able to rappel down the shaft to reach her." "And how exactly do we get to the 2nd floor of a building that's surrounded by armed men?" Sarah asked. David's expression turned grim. "I walk in the front door and surrender myself. While they're focused on me, you two find another way in." "Absolutely not," Sullivan said immediately. "That's suicide. It's a distraction," David corrected. These people want me alive, at least initially. They need to know what I told Melissa, what evidence I might have given her. Who else knows about their operation? They'll take me alive, and that gives you maybe 10 minutes to find her and get her medical attention. Sarah studied the building through Sullivan's binoculars, noting the systematic way the armed figures had positioned themselves. There's something else we need to consider. If Melissa's been hiding in that basement for hours, if she's been bleeding from a gunshot wound, she might be unconscious by now. She might not even know we're trying to help her. Then we find her and wake her up, David said with quiet determination. Because the alternative is letting her die alone in the dark, while the people who put her there get away with destroying dozens of lives. Sullivan's radio crackled with encrypted chatter that none of them could understand, but the urgency in the voices was unmistakable. Whatever timeline these people were operating on, it was accelerating. There's something else, David said, hesitating before pulling a small device from his jacket pocket. I've been recording conversations for the past 2 weeks. Everything these people said about Melissa, about the investigation, about how they plan to handle the witness problem. If something happens to me tonight, if I don't make it out of that building, this device automatically uploads everything to a secure server. Sarah took the device, surprised by how small it was. Why didn't you give this to the police 2 weeks ago? Because 2 weeks ago, I didn't know which police officers could be trusted, David admitted. The corruption goes deeper than just city contracts. There are people inside the department, inside the DA's office, inside the federal task force that's supposed to be investigating all of this. Detective Sullivan's face darkened. You're saying some of my colleagues are involved in whatever conspiracy got your sister shot? I'm saying that when Melissa first tried to report what she'd discovered, 3 different law enforcement agencies told her there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. Then, mysteriously, all of her research files were deleted from the university computers, and her faculty advisor suddenly decided she needed to find a new thesis topic. The implications hung in the cold night air like smoke. Sarah realized they weren't just trying to save one woman's life. They were walking into the middle of a conspiracy that reached into every level of Chicago's power structure. The service alley, she said, refocusing on their immediate problem. Show me exactly where it is. David pointed to a narrow passage between the Rodriguez Market and an abandoned auto repair shop. It's there, but getting to it means crossing 50 yards of open ground while staying invisible to at least 3 sniper positions. Sullivan studied the terrain through his binoculars. Unless we create a bigger distraction than just you walking in the front door. What do you mean? Sarah asked. The detective smiled grimly. I mean, we use the fact that these people are trying to cover up a federal investigation. If they think the FBI is about to raid this building, they'll either scatter or consolidate their positions to defend a single entrance. David looked skeptical. How do we convince them the FBI is coming? Sullivan pulled out his police radio and switched to an emergency frequency. This is Detective Sullivan requesting immediate federal backup at the Rodriguez Market on 5th Street. We have confirmation of federal witnesses in immediate danger. Multiple hostiles on scene. Request tactical response team and helicopter support. The response was immediate and chaotic. Multiple agencies began coordinating over the radio waves, and within minutes, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed in the distance. You just called in real federal backup, David realized. I called in everyone, Sullivan confirmed. FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, probably Homeland Security. This building is about to become the center of the biggest law enforcement operation Chicago's seen this year. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. That's good for Melissa, right? More help means better chances of getting her out alive. It also means that when this is over, when the dust settles and the investigations begin, every decision we make tonight is going to be scrutinized by federal prosecutors, Sullivan warned. Are you sure you want to be part of whatever comes next? Sarah thought about Melissa Chun, 19 years old and pregnant, hiding in a basement while people with military-grade weapons hunted her through the darkness. She thought about the oath she'd taken as a doctor, about the responsibility that came with having the skills to save lives. "I'm sure," she said simply. David was already moving toward the service alley, using parked cars and building shadows for cover. The armed figures around the Rodriguez market had begun repositioning themselves, apparently responding to orders transmitted through their communication equipment. "The real FBI response is still at least 15 minutes out," Sullivan said, following David's path. "But these people don't know that. They're going to assume federal agents are already positioning for assault." Sarah shouldered her medical bag and took her first step away from the relative safety of the patrol car. The moment felt surreal. Less than an hour ago, she'd been treating routine emergency room cases, and now she was sneaking through abandoned Chicago streets to perform surgery on a federal witness while corrupt officials and federal agents converged on their location. The service alley was darker than she'd expected, filled with debris and puddles that reflected the distant streetlights like broken mirrors. David moved ahead of them with the confidence of someone familiar with dangerous places while Sullivan covered their rear with his service weapon drawn. "The basement access is here," David whispered, pointing to a rusted metal door set into the building's foundation. "But it's been chained shut from the inside." Sarah examined the door and the surrounding wall. "Can we cut through the chain?" "Not without making noise that will alert everyone within 3 blocks, Sullivan said. "Is there another way in?" David studied the building's exterior, running his hands along the brick wall until he found what he was looking for. "Storm drain," he said, indicating a metal grate about 2 feet square. "It connects to the basement, but it's going to be tight." "How tight?" Sarah asked. "Medical bag first, then crawl," David said, already working to remove the grate. "And hope that Melissa was right about where this leads." The sound of helicopter rotors was getting closer, and shouts could be heard from the front of the building. Whatever federal response Sullivan had triggered was creating exactly the distraction they needed. But it also meant their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Sarah pushed her medical bag through the storm drain opening and then followed it into complete darkness. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders, filled with standing water that soaked through her scrubs within seconds. Behind her, she could hear David and Sullivan following, their movements echoing in the confined space. "How far?" she whispered. 20 yards. David's voice came back, distorted by the tunnel walls. "There should be a vertical shaft that leads up into the basement." The crawl through the storm drain felt endless, each foot of progress measured in scraped knees and torn clothing. Sarah's medical training had prepared her for many emergency situations, but crawling through abandoned drainage systems to reach patients wasn't covered in any textbook she'd studied. Light appeared ahead. Not electric light, but the dim glow of a flashlight or cell phone. Sarah emerged from the tunnel into a basement that smelled of mold and standing water, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb sound. And there, huddled in the corner behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets, was Melissa Chun. She was conscious, but barely responsive, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The gunshot wound in her abdomen had bled extensively, soaking through makeshift bandages that looked like torn clothing. But she was alive, and when she saw David emerging from the storm drain, her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and terror. "David," she whispered, "you came." "I'm here," he said, moving to her side. "And I brought help." Sarah was already opening her medical bag, assessing Melissa's condition with the efficiency of 8 years emergency medicine experience. Pulse weak but steady, blood pressure low, signs of significant internal bleeding, but no immediate indication of organ damage. "Melissa, I'm Dr. Mitchell. We met 6 months ago. I need you to stay awake and talk to me while I work, okay?" Melissa nodded weakly. "The baby?" Sarah placed her stethoscope against Melissa's abdomen, listening for fetal heart tones. The sound that came through was strong and regular. Incredibly, despite everything that had happened, the baby appeared to be uninjured. "Your baby's fine," Sarah said, beginning to set up in 4-line. "Strong heartbeat, normal rhythm. But I need to stop this bleeding and get you to a real hospital." Detective Sullivan emerged from the storm drain and immediately took position near the basement stairs, his weapon drawn and ready. "We've got company upstairs," he whispered. "I can hear them moving around on the first floor." David looked at his sister, then at Sarah, then at the detector who'd risked his career to help them. "The recording device I gave you, it's voice activated. Everything that happens from this point forward is going to be documented." Sarah was working to clean and assess the gunshot wound, trying to determine whether surgery could wait until they reached the hospital, or if she needed to operate immediately in these less than sterile conditions. "Melissa," she said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. How long ago were you shot? Have you lost consciousness at any point?" 3 hours, Melissa whispered. "Maybe 4. I remember crawling down here, hiding behind the pallets. I kept thinking someone was going to find me, but I was too weak to move." The gunshot wound was through and through, which was good news. It meant the bullet had exited and wasn't causing additional internal damage. But the bleeding indicated possible damage to internal organs that would require surgical repair. "We need to get her to an operating room," Sarah told David and Sullivan. "I can stabilize her here, stop the immediate bleeding, but she needs surgery within the next hour." "The federal agent Sullivan called," David said. "When they get here, can we trust them to get her safely to a hospital?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs made them all freeze. Someone was coming down. Moving carefully but purposefully, Detective Sullivan positioned himself between the stairs and Melissa, his weapon trained on the basement entrance. Sarah continued working, knowing that stopping now could mean losing her patient regardless of what other threats they faced. The footsteps stopped, and a voice called down into the darkness. "Dr. Mitchell? Detective Sullivan? I'm Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI. We received your emergency call, and we're here to help." Sullivan didn't lower his weapon. "Prove it." A badge and identification were tossed down the stairs, landing in the pool of light from Sarah's medical flashlight. The credentials looked legitimate, but in a situation where they'd already established that corruption reached into federal agencies, appearance and reality might be very different things. "Agent Torres," Sullivan called back. "How many people are in your response team?" 12 agents plus tactical support, came the reply. "We've secured the building and arrested 6 individuals who were positioned around the perimeter. No shots fired, no casualties." Sarah looked up from her work on Melissa's wound. 6 arrests matched the number of armed figures they'd observed through Sullivan's binoculars. Either this FBI agent was legitimate, or the people trying to kill Melissa had just found a very effective way to get close to their target. "David," Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible. "In my jacket pocket, the flash drive. Everything's on there." David reached into his sister's jacket and pulled out a small device that looked identical to the recording equipment he'd been carrying. "What's on it?" "Names," Melissa said, her breathing becoming more labored. "Bank accounts. Contract numbers. Everyone who's been stealing from the city for the past 5 years. Everyone who's been hurt because of it." The implications were staggering. If Melissa had documented 5 years of systematic corruption, if she had names and financial records that proved criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of city government, then the people trying to kill her weren't just covering up current crimes, they were trying to prevent the exposure of a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars. "Agent Torres," Sullivan called up the stairs. "We're coming up with a critically injured federal witness. She needs immediate medical transport to the nearest trauma center. "Ambulance is standing by," came the reply. "We're here to make sure she gets there safely." Sarah finished applying pressure bandages to Melissa's wound and helped her to her feet. The young woman was weak from blood loss but mobile, which meant they could move her without additional risk. But as they prepared to leave the basement that had been Melissa's hiding place for the past 4 hours, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of their night was just beginning. Getting Melissa out of the building alive was only the first step in exposing a conspiracy that reached into every level of Chicago's power structure. And somewhere in the darkness, above them, people who had already tried to kill once were waiting to see whether their second attempt would be more successful. The basement stairs creaked under their weight as Sarah helped Melissa climb toward what they hoped was rescue. Each step sent fresh blood seeping through the bandages, and Melissa's breathing grew more labored with the exertion. Behind them, David carried the medical equipment while Detective Sullivan maintained rear guard, his weapon still drawn despite Agent Torres's assurances. The main floor of the Rodriguez Market was a maze of abandoned shelving units and debris, illuminated by harsh LED floodlights that the FBI team had set up throughout the building. Sarah's eyes took a moment to adjust after the basement darkness, and what she saw made her heart sink. Agent Rebecca Torres was exactly what she'd expected from a federal law enforcement officer: professional, competent, and completely focused on controlling the situation. But the 12 other agents positioned throughout the building weren't wearing FBI tactical gear. Their equipment was unmarked, their faces were covered, and their weapons were pointed not outward toward potential threats, but inward toward the people they were supposedly there to protect. "Dr. Mitchell," Agent Torres said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "thank you for taking such good care of our witness. We'll handle things from here." Sarah felt Melissa tense against her arm. The young woman had spent months investigating corruption, learning to recognize the difference between legitimate law enforcement and people who used badges to hide criminal intent. And right now, every instinct she'd developed was screaming that Agent Torres represented the latter. "Where's the ambulance?" Sarah asked, continuing to support Melissa while scanning the room for actual exits. "Just outside," Torres replied smoothly. "But first we need to debrief Ms. Chun about her investigation. There are some gaps in our intelligence that only she can fill." Detective Sullivan stepped forward, his badge clearly visible and his weapon still drawn. "Agent Torres, this woman needs immediate medical attention. Debriefing can happen at the hospital." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Detective Sullivan." Torres's tone remained polite, but steel crept into her voice. "Ms. Chun's investigation has created some complications that need to be resolved before she can be moved to a public facility." David pulled the flash drive from his pocket, holding it where everyone could see. "Is this what you're worried about? All the evidence my sister collected about city contract fraud, money laundering, and murder-for-hire schemes." The change in Agent Torres's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The professional mask slipped just enough to reveal the calculating predator underneath. "Mr. Chun, I think you've misunderstood the scope of your sister's investigation. There are national security implications that go far beyond local corruption." "National security," Melissa whispered, her voice filled with bitter understanding. "That's what they always say when they want to make evidence disappear." Sarah realized with growing horror that Sullivan's call for federal backup had worked. Exactly as intended, it had brought federal agents to their location. The problem was that some of those agents were exactly the people they'd been trying to avoid. "Agent Torres," Sarah said carefully, "I need to verify your credentials before I release my patient to your custody. As her treating physician, I have legal obligations that supersede federal jurisdiction." Torres smiled again, and this time the expression was genuinely amused. "Dr. Mitchell, I think you're operating under some misconceptions about how federal investigations work. Ms. Chun is a material witness in an ongoing national security matter. Her medical care will be provided by appropriate federal facilities. What federal facilities? Sullivan demanded. I want names, locations, supervising physicians. That information is classified, Torres replied. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like minutes. Sarah could feel Melissa getting weaker, could see the pallor in her face that indicated ongoing blood loss. But she could also sense the predatory stillness of the unmarked agents positioned around the room, waiting for orders that would determine whether anyone left this building alive. David made a decision that surprised everyone. Agent Torres, I have a proposal. I'm listening. The flash drive my sister was carrying, it's encrypted. She's the only one who knows the password. If you want access to her investigation files, you need her alive and conscious and willing to cooperate. Torres studied him carefully. And why would she be willing to cooperate with federal agents? Because, David said, pulling out his own recording device, she's been documenting everything for the past 4 hours. Every conversation, every threat, every admission of criminal intent. If something happens to her, if she disappears into some black site facility, all of that documentation gets released to every major news outlet in the country. Sarah felt a spark of hope. David was creating leverage, using the same surveillance techniques that had brought them to this point to protect his sister from the people who wanted her silenced. But Agent Torres just laughed. Mr. Chun, you're assuming that public exposure is something we're concerned about. You're assuming that news outlets will publish stories that implicate federal agencies in criminal activity. You're assuming that your recording device will continue functioning long enough to upload anything to anywhere. As if on cue, David's device went silent. The small red light that had indicated active recording flickered and died. Signal jammers, Torres explained helpfully. Very effective against most consumer electronics. We've been using them since we arrived. Sarah felt the situation sliding beyond anyone's control. Melissa was getting weaker by the minute. The supposed rescue team was clearly compromised, and their only leverage had just been neutralized by federal technology. That's when Detective Sullivan made a move that changed everything. Instead of threatening Agent Torres or trying to negotiate further, he holstered his weapon and pulled out his phone. But instead of trying to make a call, he activated an application that Sarah had never seen before. Agent Torres, Sullivan said calmly, I think you should know that Chicago PD has been conducting its own investigation into federal corruption for the past 6 months. Every conversation that's happened in this building tonight has been transmitted to a secure server that's beyond the reach of your signal jammers. Torres's confidence wavered for the first time. That's impossible. Our equipment would have detected any transmission devices. Not if they're built into standard police communication gear, Sullivan replied. Not if they're using frequencies that federal agencies aren't monitoring, because they assume local police don't have access to that level of technology. Sarah realized that Sullivan had been planning for this possibility from the moment they'd left the hospital. His call for federal backup hadn't been just a distraction. It had been bait, designed to draw out exactly the kind of compromised agents they were now facing. Detective Sullivan, Torres said, her voice taking on a more dangerous edge. You're interfering with a federal investigation. I'm documenting federal crimes, Sullivan corrected. And right now, those crimes include conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder of a federal witness. The unmarked agents around the room shifted their positions, clearly receiving orders through their communication equipment. Sarah could see the situation escalating toward violence that none of them would survive. That's when Melissa Chun, despite her injuries and blood loss, did something that stunned everyone in the room. She laughed. It started as a weak chuckle, but grew stronger, filled with genuine amusement that seemed completely inappropriate for their circumstances. You people, she said, looking directly at Agent Torres, You're so focused on covering up the money you've been stealing that you completely missed the real investigation. Torres's expression went cold. What do you mean? Melissa reached into her jacket and pulled out a second device, not a flash drive, but something that looked like a modified cell phone. The corruption in city contracts, the money laundering, the murder-for-hire schemes, that was just the beginning. What I really found was evidence of how federal agencies have been using local corruption to fund black operations that Congress never authorized. The silence that followed was absolute. You've been using Chicago as a testing ground, Melissa continued, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. Using corrupted city officials to launder money, using local criminal organizations to eliminate witnesses, using municipal infrastructure to hide federal crimes. The city contract fraud was just the visible tip of something much larger. Agent Torres's professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked like panic. You don't understand what you're dealing with. There are national security interests at stake that are bigger than any of us. National security, David repeated with disgust. That's what you call it when you murder American citizens who ask inconvenient questions. Sarah realized that the flash drive David had shown earlier was probably a decoy. The real evidence, the information that had made Melissa a target worth killing, was stored on the device she was now holding. And from the way Agent Torres was reacting, that information was far more damaging than anyone had realized. The modified cell phone, Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. It's been transmitting this entire time, hasn't it? Even through the signal jammers, Melissa nodded weakly. Military-grade encryption, satellite uplink, real-time data transmission to multiple secure servers. Every word spoken in this building tonight has been recorded and distributed to journalists, federal prosecutors, and congressional oversight committees. Agent Torres reached for her weapon, but Detective Sullivan was faster. His service pistol was trained on her before she could clear her holster. Agent Torres, Sullivan said quietly, I think it's time for you to make a choice. You can continue trying to cover up federal crimes, or you can help us get a critically injured witness to a hospital where she can survive to testify about what she's discovered. The unmarked agents around the room were clearly receiving conflicting orders through their communication equipment. Some were moving to support Torres, while others seemed to be backing away from the situation entirely. There's something else you should know, Melissa said, her voice growing weaker but her resolve remaining strong. The evidence I collected doesn't just implicate individual agents or single operations. It documents a systematic pattern of federal agencies using local corruption to circumvent congressional oversight and constitutional limitations. Sarah felt the weight of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about saving one woman's life anymore. This was about exposing a shadow network that operated within the federal government, using local corruption as cover for activities that violated every principle of democratic accountability. Agent Torres, she said, returning her focus to her medical responsibilities. My patient needs surgery within the next 30 minutes, or she's going to die from internal bleeding. Whatever political or legal consequences follow from her investigation, they're meaningless if she doesn't survive to see them through. Torres looked around the room, calculating odds and options with the desperation of someone who knew that their career and freedom hung in the balance. The unmarked agents were clearly waiting for orders, but those orders would have to account for the fact that everything happening in the building was being recorded and transmitted in real time. Dr. Mitchell, Torres said finally, if I arrange for medical transport to a secure facility where Ms. Chun can receive appropriate treatment, will you guarantee her cooperation with ongoing federal investigations? I'll guarantee that she receives medical care that meets professional standards, Sarah replied carefully. Everything else is between her and whatever legitimate legal processes apply to federal witnesses. It was a diplomatic non-answer that committed her to nothing beyond her medical obligations. But it was also an opening for Torres to save face while backing down from a confrontation that had already spiraled beyond her control. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside the building interrupted whatever response Torres might have given. But these weren't unmarked tactical vehicles or federal agency cars. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of Chicago PD patrol cars, ambulances, and what sounded like news vans. Detective Sullivan smiled grimly. My backup call included more than just federal agencies, he explained. I also contacted every major news outlet in Chicago, told them there was a breaking story about federal corruption and attempted murder of a witness. By my count, we should have reporters from at least 6 different organizations setting up outside right about now. Agent Torres's face went pale as she realized that their isolated building had just become the center of a very public media circus. Whatever plan she'd had for quietly disposing of witnesses and evidence had just become impossible to execute. Agent Torres, Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying absolute determination. You have 30 seconds to decide whether you want to be remembered as the federal agent who protected a witness or as the one who let her die to cover up government crimes. The choice that followed would determine not just whether Melissa Chun survived the night, but whether the corruption network she'd uncovered would be exposed or buried forever beneath layers of federal classification and national security claims. 30 seconds Agent Torres had been given to make her decision stretched into an eternity measured by Melissa's increasingly labored breathing and the growing sound of chaos outside the Rodriguez market. Through the boarded windows, camera flashes strobed like lightning, and Sarah could hear reporters shouting questions at anyone who would listen. Torres reached for her communication device, but before she could speak into it, the building's main entrance exploded inward. Not from forced entry by law enforcement, but from the arrival of someone who clearly had authority that superseded everyone else in the room. The man who walked through the debris was tall, gray-haired, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His suit was expensive but understated, his identification was FBI, and his expression suggested that he was profoundly disappointed in everything he was seeing. Agent Torres, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. Stand down immediately. Deputy Director Morrison, Torres replied, her voice betraying the first genuine fear Sarah had heard from her all night. Sir, the situation is under control. The situation, Morrison said, looking around the abandoned market at the armed standoff between federal agents and local police, is a complete disaster that's being broadcast live on every major news network in the country. Stand down, your people, now. The unmarked agents around the room began lowering their weapons, responding to orders transmitted through their communication equipment. Sarah felt some of the tension leave the room, but Melissa's medical condition was deteriorating by the minute. Deputy Director Morrison, Sarah said, stepping forward with the authority that came from 8 years of emergency medicine. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. This woman needs immediate surgical intervention. Whatever jurisdictional issues need to be resolved can happen after she's in an operating room. Morrison looked at Melissa, taking in her pale complexion and the blood-soaked bandages. Then, Sarah's medical bag and improvised treatment setup. Doctor, what's her current condition? Gunshot wound to the abdomen with significant internal bleeding. I've stabilized her for transport, but she needs surgery within the next 20 minutes. Or she's going to go into irreversible shock. Then we get her to a hospital, Morrison said simply. Agent Torres, you and your team are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Detective Sullivan, I need you to coordinate with the ambulance crew outside. But Agent Torres wasn't finished. Sir, you don't understand the implications. This witness has information that could compromise ongoing national security operations. Information that foreign governments would pay millions to obtain. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his voice grew colder. Agent Torres, are you suggesting that we should let an American citizen die to protect classified information? I'm suggesting that there are bigger considerations than one person's life. The silence that followed was broken by Melissa herself, who had been listening to the exchange with growing anger despite her physical weakness. "Deputy Director Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute clarity, "I want you to know that everything Agent Torres just said is being recorded and transmitted in real time. The American people are going to hear a federal agent argue that my life is expendable to protect government secrets." Morrison studied the modified cell phone in Melissa's hand, understanding immediately what it represented. "Miss Chun, I assume you're the federal witness who's been investigating corruption in Chicago City contracts. I'm the federal witness who uncovered evidence that federal agencies have been using Chicago City contracts to fund unauthorized black operations," Melissa corrected. "Operations that include surveillance of American citizens, elimination of witnesses, and systematic subversion of congressional oversight." The weight of her words settled over the room like smoke. Sarah realized that what they were dealing with went far beyond local corruption or even federal crime. They were looking at evidence of shadow government operations that violated the fundamental principles of democratic accountability. "Ms. Chun," Morrison said carefully, "those are very serious allegations. Allegations that will require extensive investigation and corroboration. Allegations that are fully documented," David added, holding up the original flash drive. "Names, dates, financial records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence. 5 years of systematic criminal activity by people who thought they were beyond accountability." Morrison's phone began ringing with an urgency that suggested the call couldn't be ignored. He answered it, listened for a moment, then hung up with an expression that had grown considerably grimmer. "That was the Attorney General," he said. "Apparently, the recordings that have been transmitted from this building tonight have already reached the Department of Justice, several congressional committees, and at least 3 major newspapers. This situation has moved beyond damage control." Agent Torres looked like someone watching their entire career dissolve in real time. "Sir, if we can contain the witness testimony, if we can classify the evidence under national security provisions." "Agent Torres," Morrison interrupted, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder of a federal witness." The speed with which Morrison's backup agents moved to restrain Torres was impressive. Sarah realized that the deputy director had come prepared for exactly this scenario, which suggested that federal law enforcement had been investigating the corruption network independently. "Detective Sullivan," Morrison said, "I need you to escort Dr. Mitchell and Miss Chun to the ambulance. Make sure the medical team understands that their patient is under federal protection and that any attempt to interfere with her treatment will be considered an act of terrorism." Sullivan nodded, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his expression. "Deputy Director, how do we know that the hospital staff haven't been compromised? How do we know that Miss Chun will be safe when she's in surgery?" Morrison pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. "Dr. Mitchell, you're about to be joined by a surgical team from Walter Reed Medical Center. They're being flown in by military helicopter and should arrive at Chicago General within the next 15 minutes. Ms. Chun's surgery will be performed by military physicians under federal security protocols." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued wariness. Military medical care would certainly be competent, but it would also remove Melissa from any civilian oversight during the most vulnerable phase of her treatment. "Deputy Director Morrison," Melissa said, her voice growing weaker but her resolve remaining strong, "I want Dr. Mitchell to remain as my primary physician throughout any surgical procedures. I want Detective Sullivan to maintain security coordination with Chicago PD and I want my brother David to have unrestricted access during my recovery." Morrison studied her for a moment, perhaps recognizing that someone who had successfully investigated federal corruption for 5 years wasn't going to trust federal authorities without significant safeguards. "Agreed," he said. "Dr. Mitchell, are you willing to work with military surgeons to ensure continuity of care?" "As long as patient welfare remains the primary consideration," Sarah replied. "I won't be party to any procedure that prioritizes security over medical necessity." "Understood." As they prepared to move Melissa out of the building, David approached Sarah with an expression of gratitude mixed with continuing concern. "Dr. Mitchell, I need you to know that everything that happened tonight, everything my sister uncovered, it's going to have consequences that reach far beyond Chicago. People are going to try to discredit her testimony, to claim that she's lying or mentally unstable or motivated by money." Sarah looked at the young woman she was helping support, thinking about the courage it had taken to investigate federal corruption while pregnant and alone. To hide in a basement for hours while bleeding from a gunshot wound, to continue fighting for accountability even when death seemed certain. "David," she said, "your sister is one of the strongest people I've ever met. Whatever comes next, whatever investigations or trials or political consequences follow from tonight, she's going to face them with the same determination she showed in that basement." As they emerged from the Rodriguez market, Sarah was stunned by the scale of law enforcement and media presence that had assembled. The street was filled with FBI vehicles, Chicago PD cars, ambulances, and news vans from every major network. Reporters were broadcasting live from behind police barriers, and helicopters circled overhead with searchlights that turned night into day. The ambulance that waited for them was unlike any Sarah had seen before. Military specifications, advanced life support equipment, and a security escort that included both federal agents and Chicago police officers. As they loaded Melissa onto the stretcher, she reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, "whatever happens in surgery, whatever happens during the investigations that follow, I need you to know that you saved my life tonight. Not just medically, but by choosing to trust a stranger when every logical reason said you shouldn't." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "Melissa, you saved your own life by having the courage to investigate corruption when everyone told you to look the other way. I just provided medical care. You provided hope," Melissa corrected. "You proved that there are still people in positions of authority who put saving lives above protecting institutions." As the ambulance pulled away with its escort of federal and local law enforcement, Sarah realized that her quiet Tuesday night shift had become something far more significant. The choice she'd made to trust David Chun, to leave the safety of the hospital and crawl through storm drains to reach a bleeding witness, had helped expose a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of government. Detective Sullivan approached her as they watched the convoy disappear into the Chicago night. "Dr. Mitchell, you realize that what happened tonight is going to change everything. Not just for Melissa Chun or her brother, but for everyone who is involved in covering up what she discovered." Sarah looked around at the scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents arresting their own colleagues, reporters documenting evidence of government corruption, police officers coordinating with agencies they'd never worked with before. "Detective," she said, "what happened tonight proves that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that go against everything you've been trained to do, safely. Sometimes saving one life means risking everything you thought you knew about how the system works." Sullivan smiled grimly. "And sometimes the system needs people who are willing to risk everything to make it work the way it's supposed to." As Sarah rode back toward Chicago General in Sullivan's patrol car, she reflected on the series of choices that had brought them to this point. David Chun's decision to trust a doctor who had once bent rules to help his sister. Her decision to leave the hospital despite every protocol that said she should stay. Sullivan's decision to call for backup that included media attention. Melissa's decision to continue investigating despite threats to her life. Each choice had seemed impossible at the time, but together they had created the opportunity for truth to emerge from a web of corruption that had seemed impenetrable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the hospital. "Dr. Mitchell, please report to the emergency department immediately. A military surgical team has arrived and is requesting consultation on incoming trauma patients. Your presence is required for continuity of care protocols." Sarah realized that her night was far from over. Melissa Chun would need surgery that could last several hours, followed by recovery and testimony that would reshape the political landscape of Chicago and possibly the entire country. But as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years of emergency medicine. The absolute certainty that she had made the right choice, regardless of consequences. The emergency room doors that had seemed so familiar 12 hours earlier now looked different, charged with the knowledge that sometimes the most important medical cases were the ones that happened outside hospital walls, in abandoned basements, and storm drains and places where protocols couldn't follow. Deputy Director Morrison was waiting for her in the emergency department, along with the military surgical team and a collection of federal agents whose job was apparently to ensure that Melissa Chun survived long enough to testify about everything she had discovered. "Dr. Mitchell," Morrison said as she approached, "before we proceed with surgery, I need you to understand that Ms. Chun's testimony is going to implicate federal officials at the highest levels of government. There will be efforts to discredit her, to claim that her evidence was fabricated or that her injuries were self-inflicted. Your medical documentation of her condition tonight is going to be crucial evidence in prosecutions that could last for years." Sarah looked through the emergency department windows at the media circus still visible in the distance, at the federal agents and military personnel who now filled the hospital corridors, at the normal chaos of emergency medicine that had been transformed into something unprecedented. "Deputy Director Morrison," she said, "I'm a doctor. My job is to save lives and document medical conditions accurately. Everything else is beyond my expertise and outside my responsibilities." Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd met him. "Dr. Mitchell, I think your definition of responsibility might be broader than you realize. What you did tonight, the choices you made when conventional wisdom said you should prioritize your own safety, that's exactly the kind of responsibility this country needs from people in positions of authority." As they prepared to enter the operating room where military surgeons would work alongside her to save Melissa Chun's life, Sarah realized that David Chun's warning had been prophetic. His next step really had changed both of their lives forever, not just because of the medical emergency they'd faced, but because of the choice to trust each other when trust seemed impossible. The operating room doors closed behind them at 4:47 a.m., exactly 2 hours after David Chen had first walked into the emergency department covered in someone else's blood. But Sarah knew that when those doors opened again, when Melissa Chun emerged from surgery with the evidence that would expose years of federal corruption, the real work of accountability and justice would just be beginning. And for the first time in her medical career, she was looking forward to being part of something larger than individual patient care, part of a system that actually worked the way it was supposed to, where saving lives meant more than just stopping bleeding, and where the oath to first do no harm extended far beyond the walls of any hospital. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the witness gallery of a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching as the final defendant in what the media had dubbed Operation Clean Sweep received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal officials, and family members of people whose lives had been destroyed by the corruption network that Melissa Chun had exposed. The surgery that night at Chicago General had lasted 7 hours. Military surgeons working alongside Sarah had discovered internal damage, far more extensive than initial assessments had indicated. The bullet had nicked Melissa's liver and caused bleeding that would have been fatal within another hour. But the young woman's determination to survive, combined with world-class medical care, had pulled her through the critical period. Melissa's baby, a daughter she'd named Hope, had been born 3 months later at Walter Reed Medical Center under continued federal protection. The symbolism hadn't been lost on anyone. New life emerging from a case that had exposed the systematic destruction of so many others. The trials that followed had reshaped Chicago's political landscape and sent shockwaves through federal agencies. Across the country, 37 people had been indicted, including 2 federal judges, a U.S. attorney, 6 FBI agents, the mayor of Chicago, and the CEOs of 4 major construction companies. The financial scope of the corruption had exceeded $200 million over 5 years, but the human cost had been far higher. Sarah had testified in 8 different trials, each time recounting the medical evidence that proved Melissa Chun had been shot by someone attempting to silence her investigation. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing that the conspiracy included attempted murder of a federal witness, elevating charges that might otherwise have resulted in minimal sentences. Detective Sullivan had been promoted to lieutenant and placed in charge of a new anti-corruption unit within Chicago PD. His decision to call for media backup that night had been vindicated by subsequent investigations that revealed the extent to which traditional law enforcement channels had been compromised. David Chun had entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, but not before spending 3 months working with FBI investigators to decode the financial networks his former employers had used to launder money through city contracts. His inside knowledge had been instrumental in unraveling the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Agent Torres had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. During her sentencing hearing, she'd testified about pressure from superiors to contain investigations that threatened to expose federal involvement in local corruption. Her testimony had led to additional investigations that were still ongoing. Deputy Director Morrison had been promoted to Associate Deputy Director and placed in charge of a new FBI division focused specifically on corruption within federal agencies. The success of Operation Clean Sweep had demonstrated that internal accountability was not just possible but essential for maintaining public trust in law enforcement institutions. As Sarah watched the final sentencing conclude, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed since that Tuesday night when David Chun had walked into her emergency room covered in blood. The formal reprimands in her personnel file for bending hospital protocols had been replaced with commendations for extraordinary service. She'd been offered positions at prestigious hospitals across the country, but had chosen to remain at Chicago General, where she now directed a new program providing medical care to witnesses in federal investigations. The program had been funded by money recovered from the corruption prosecutions, a fitting use of assets that had been stolen from the public treasury. Sarah's team now included specialized trauma surgeons, psychiatrists, and security personnel trained to protect witnesses whose lives were threatened by their willingness to expose criminal activity. The work was challenging in ways that traditional emergency medicine had never been. Treating people who had risked everything to expose corruption required not just medical expertise, but understanding of the psychological trauma that came with challenging powerful institutions. Sarah had learned to recognize the particular kind of stress that affected whistleblowers, people who knew that their safety depended on the integrity of systems they discovered were fundamentally compromised, but it was also the most meaningful work she'd ever done. 3 weeks after the final sentencing, Sarah received a call that brought her full circle to where everything had started. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Elena Rodriguez. I work for the Tribune. I'm investigating allegations of corruption in the city's emergency medical services contracts, and I think I might be in danger." The voice on the phone was young, frightened, and determined, exactly like Melissa Chun had been 6 months earlier. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of professional obligation and personal risk that had defined her career since that transformational night. "Ms. Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully, "what kind of danger are you talking about?" "Someone broke into my apartment last night. Nothing was stolen, but all my research files had been gone through. And this morning, my car wouldn't start. The brake lines had been cut." Sarah's training in witness protection protocols kicked in immediately. "Where are you calling from?" "A payphone at Union Station." "I don't trust my cell phone anymore. Ms. Rodriguez, I want you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't call anyone else. Don't use any electronic devices. I'm going to send someone to get you, and we're going to make sure you're safe while we figure out what you've discovered." As Sarah coordinated Elena Rodriguez's protection through the witness program she now directed, she realized that the work Melissa Chun had started was far from finished. Corruption was like a cancer. Removing one tumor didn't guarantee that. Others wouldn't appear elsewhere in the system, but Sarah had also learned that the antidote to institutional corruption was individual courage. People like Melissa Chun and Elena Rodriguez, who chose to investigate wrongdoing despite personal risk. People like Detective Sullivan, who chose to trust journalists over federal agents when the situation demanded it. People like David Chun, who chose family loyalty over criminal profits when forced to make that choice. And people like herself, who chose to trust strangers in crisis, even when conventional wisdom suggested that safety lay in following established protocols. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in the same emergency room where everything had begun, waiting for Elena Rodriguez to arrive under protective escort. The Tuesday night shift was busy but routine: heart attacks, car accidents, domestic violence cases, the normal chaos of urban emergency medicine. Marcus, the security guard who had witnessed David Chun's arrival 6 months earlier, approached her with a smile. "Dr. Mitchell, are you expecting another dramatic entrance tonight?" Sarah laughed, realizing how much their perception of normal had changed. "Marcus, I'm hoping for a quiet night. But if someone shows up covered in blood, claiming that they need help saving a federal witness, let's assume they're telling the truth until we can prove otherwise." "Copy that, Doc. Trust first, verify later." When Elena Rodriguez arrived, she looked exactly like Sarah had expected: young, scared, but carrying herself with the determination of someone who had discovered something important enough to risk her life for. She was escorted by 2 federal agents Sarah recognized from Melissa's protective detail, professionals who understood that their job was to enable truth-telling, not suppress it. "Ms. Rodriguez," Sarah said, extending her hand, "welcome to Chicago." "General, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I want you to know that you're safe here." Elena's grip was firm, despite her obvious fear. "Dr. Mitchell, I've read about what you did for Melissa Chun. I know what it cost you, and I know what it achieved. I'm hoping you'll help me finish what she started." "What do you mean?" Elena pulled out a tablet computer and showed Sarah a spreadsheet filled with contract numbers, dollar amounts, and vendor names. Melissa's investigation focused on construction and medical supply contracts. "But I've been looking at emergency services, ambulance companies, helicopter transport, medical equipment maintenance. The same patterns she found, the same financial irregularities, but involving companies that have direct access to patients during their most vulnerable moments." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. If corruption had infected emergency medical services, it meant that patient care itself had been compromised for financial gain. Lives had literally been put at risk to generate illegal profits. How many contracts are we talking about? Sarah asked. 63 companies over the past 4 years, Elena replied. Everything from ambulance dispatching to medical helicopter maintenance to emergency room equipment calibration. Someone has been systematically infiltrating every aspect of emergency medical care in this city, The scope was staggering. Sarah realized that every emergency she'd handled over the past 4 years might have been affected by equipment that wasn't properly maintained, ambulances that weren't properly staffed, or communication systems that weren't properly functioning. All because someone was skimming money from contracts designed to save lives. "Elena," Sarah said, "what kind of evidence do you have?" "Bank records, email communications, recorded phone calls, photographic documentation of equipment that was supposed to be maintained but wasn't. But the most important evidence is what I discovered about response times and patient outcomes." Elena pulled up another spreadsheet that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed emergency response times that had increased by an average of 4 minutes over the past 2 years, correlated with a statistically significant increase in preventable deaths from heart attacks, strokes, and trauma cases. "People have been dying," Elena said quietly, "because someone decided that emergency medical services were a good place to hide illegal profits." Sarah stared at the data, thinking about every patient she'd lost despite her best efforts, every case where delayed response times had made the difference between life and death. How many of those deaths could have been prevented if emergency services hadn't been corrupted by criminal greed? "Elena, this evidence needs to reach federal prosecutors immediately. But first, we need to make sure you're protected from the same people who tried to kill Melissa Chun." "Dr. Mitchell," Elena said, "there's something else you need to know. The corruption in emergency medical services, it's not just local. I found evidence that the same financial patterns exist in at least 6 other major cities. This is a national network that's been using emergency medical care as a source of illegal revenue." The implications were overwhelming. If Elena was right, if the corruption network extended beyond Chicago to other major cities, then thousands of lives had been put at risk by people who saw emergency medical care as just another opportunity for financial exploitation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Deputy Director Morrison. "Dr. Mitchell, we've received intelligence indicating that Ms. Rodriguez may be targeted tonight. Federal protection in place, but recommend maximum security protocols." "Elena," Sarah said, "I want you to know that what you've discovered is going to save lives, but it's also going to put you in the same kind of danger that Melissa faced. Are you prepared for what that means?" Elena Rodriguez looked around the VIB emergency room, at the patients being treated by medical professionals who had dedicated their lives to saving others, at the equipment and systems that were supposed to function flawlessly during life and death moments. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, "6 months ago, Melissa Chun proved that individual courage can expose institutional corruption. Tonight, I'm hoping to prove that her sacrifice wasn't just about one investigation. It was about changing how we protect the systems that protect all of us." As federal agents positioned themselves around the emergency room and Sarah prepared to begin another night that would reshape everything she thought she knew about medical care in America, she realized that David Chun's warning had been more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. His next step hadn't just changed 2 lives forever. It had set in motion a series of revelations that would continue exposing corruption, protecting witnesses, and proving that sometimes the most important medical intervention wasn't treating individual patients, it was treating the diseases that infected entire systems. The emergency room clock read 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night that was about to become every bit as transformational as the one that had started everything 6 months earlier. And Sarah Mitchell, the doctor who had once thought her responsibility ended at hospital walls, was ready to follow evidence wherever it led, no matter how many powerful people preferred that the truth remain buried, because she had learned that the oath to first do no harm sometimes required risking everything to protect the systems that were supposed to protect everyone else. The story that had begun with a desperate brother trying to save his sister's life had become something much larger, proof that in a democracy, Accountability ultimately depended on individuals who were willing to trust each other enough to demand the truth, even when that truth threatened to destroy everything they thought they understood about the institutions they served. And as Elena Rodriguez prepared to expose the next layer of corruption that was literally killing innocent people, Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. Elena Rodriguez's investigation into emergency medical services corruption had been running for 3 weeks when the first attempt on her life occurred. Unlike Melissa Chun's case, where the attackers had used a direct approach, Elena's would-be killers employed more sophisticated methods that nearly succeeded. The attempt came during what should have been the safest possible circumstances. While Elena was under federal protection at a secure medical facility, undergoing routine health screening as part of the witness protection protocols Sarah had established. The facility was Walter Reed Medical Center, the same hospital where Melissa had given birth to Hope, and security was supposed to be impenetrable. Sarah received the emergency call at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning that would prove to be as transformational as the Tuesday night when everything had begun. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Colonel James Harrison at Walter Reed. We have a code black situation involving your witness. Ms. Rodriguez has been poisoned." Sarah was already reaching for her emergency medical bag before the words fully registered. Poisoned how? When? What's her current condition? Unknown toxin, administered approximately 2 hours ago through her 4-line during routine saline administration. She's conscious but experiencing cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory distress, and neurological symptoms consistent with organophosphate poisoning. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Organophosphate compounds were sophisticated chemical weapons, not the kind of poison that random criminals would have access to. This was an assassination attempt using military-grade materials, which meant Elena's investigation had threatened someone with access to resources far beyond local corruption networks. "Colonel Harrison, I'm 45 minutes out. Have you administered atropine? Negative. The attending physician is concerned about drug interactions with an unknown compound. We're maintaining supportive care until we can identify the specific toxin." Sarah was already in her car, driving through empty Chicago streets toward the highway that would take her to Walter Reed. Colonel Elena Rodriguez is not just any witness. She's investigating corruption that extends to emergency medical services in at least 6 major cities. If someone was willing to use chemical weapons to silence her, we're dealing with a conspiracy that has access to resources we haven't encountered before. The drive to Walter Reed gave Sarah time to think about the implications of what was happening. Elena's investigation had uncovered evidence that emergency medical services corruption was part of a national network, but the use of sophisticated poisons suggested international connections. Someone with access to chemical weapons had decided that Elena's evidence was worth killing for, which meant her discoveries went far beyond financial fraud. When Sarah arrived at Walter Reed, the scene was unlike anything she'd experienced during her work with the Witness Protection Program. The hospital was under complete lockdown, with military security that extended far beyond normal federal protection protocols. Colonel Harrison met her at the security checkpoint with an expression that confirmed her worst fears. "Dr. Mitchell, the situation has escalated beyond what we initially understood. The poison used against Ms. Rodriguez has been identified as a binary compound, 2 harmless chemicals that become lethal when combined. This level of sophistication suggests state-level actors." Sarah felt the weight of what they were facing. "State-level actors? You mean foreign governments?" "We mean actors with access to resources that only governments typically possess. Whether foreign or domestic is still under investigation." As they walked through corridors filled with armed military personnel, Sarah realized that Elena's investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than local corruption. The emergency medical services network that had been systematically compromised wasn't just about stealing money from city contracts. It was about controlling critical infrastructure. That could affect national security. Elena was conscious when Sarah reached her room, but barely. The young investigative reporter was connected to multiple monitoring devices and surrounded by medical equipment that Sarah recognized as being used for chemical weapons exposure. "Dr. Mitchell," Elena whispered, her voice hoarse from respiratory distress, "I found something. Something that explains why they're willing to kill to stop me." Sarah checked Elena's vital signs while listening. Heart rate elevated but stable, blood pressure low but manageable, neurological responses consistent with exposure to organophosphate compounds, but not at levels that would cause permanent damage. "Elena, what did you find?" Elena gestured toward a laptop computer that sat on the bedside table, guarded by 2 federal agents. The emergency medical services contracts aren't just about money, they're about control. Control of response times, control of patient transport, control of who lives and who dies during medical emergencies. Sarah felt understanding begin to dawn with horrifying clarity. "You're saying someone has been manipulating emergency medical care for political purposes?" "I'm saying someone has been using emergency medical services as a weapon," Elena corrected, her voice growing stronger despite her physical condition. "Delayed response times in specific neighborhoods, equipment failures during politically sensitive situations, selective targeting of witnesses and investigators through compromised medical care." The implications were staggering. If Elena was right, if the corruption network had been using emergency medical services to eliminate people who threatened their operations, then every aspect of medical care in major cities had been weaponized by criminal organizations. "Elena, what evidence do you have?" Elena nodded toward the laptop. Response time data correlated with the deaths of 17 different whistleblowers over the past 3 years. Equipment failure reports that coincide with medical emergencies involving federal witnesses. Financial records showing payments to ambulance companies for selective service modifications. Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with corruption anymore. They were dealing with systematic murder disguised as medical accidents, carried out through compromised emergency services that were supposed to save lives. Colonel Harrison approached with a tablet computer that displayed real-time intelligence briefings. "Dr. Mitchell, we've received additional information about the scope of Ms. Rodriguez's investigation. The Department of Defense has confirmed that emergency medical services in 17 major cities show evidence of systematic compromise." 17 cities? Sarah repeated, understanding the scope for the first time. 17 cities where federal witnesses, investigative journalists, and whistleblowers have died during medical emergencies that showed statistically impossible failure rates for emergency response systems. Sarah felt the weight of what they'd uncovered. The corruption network that Melissa Chun had exposed in Chicago wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a national infrastructure of murder that used medical emergencies as cover for eliminating people who threaten powerful interests. "Colonel, who has the resources to coordinate something like this?" "That's what we're trying to determine. But preliminary analysis suggests coordination between organized crime, corrupted government officials, and possibly foreign intelligence services. Ms. Rodriguez's investigation has uncovered evidence of a shadow network that operates within legitimate medical infrastructure." Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Deputy Director Morrison. "Dr. Mitchell, urgent briefing required. New intelligence indicates immediate threat to all witnesses in corruption cases. Recommend maximum security protocols for all protected individuals." The message confirmed what Sarah was beginning to understand. Elena's investigation hadn't just uncovered another layer of corruption. It had exposed a systematic method of murder that threatened every person who had ever tried to expose criminal activity in major American cities. "Elena," Sarah said, returning her attention to her patient, "the poison they used against you, it was designed to look like a medical accident, wasn't it? Cardiac arrest from an allergic reaction to routine medications." Elena nodded weakly. If I hadn't been under federal protection, if there hadn't been continuous monitoring, it would have appeared to be a tragic but explainable medical event. Just like the 17 other witnesses who died during medical emergencies. Sarah realized that she was looking at the future that awaited anyone who threatened the network Elena had discovered. Medical emergencies that weren't emergencies. Equipment failures that weren't accidents. Response delays that weren't coincidental. Dr. Mitchell, Colonel Harrison said, we need to discuss immediate protective measures. Ms. Rodriguez's investigation has identified her as a target for elimination. But it's also identified everyone who's helped her as potential targets. Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with understanding that her life had just changed irrevocably. You're saying I'm now a target because I'm treating Elena. We're saying that anyone who supports witnesses exposing this network becomes part of the threat matrix that the network needs to eliminate. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone rang with a call from Chicago General. The voice that answered was Patricia Williams, the head nurse who had worked emergency rooms for 23 years. Dr. Mitchell, we have a problem. 3 ambulances that were supposed to transport critical patients to our emergency room tonight have experienced simultaneous equipment failures. All 3 patients died en route. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Patricia, were any of those patients connected to ongoing federal investigations? 2 of them were. One was a witness in a corruption case, and one was the wife of a detective who's been investigating municipal contract fraud. The pattern was unmistakable. Elena's investigation had exposed a network that was actively eliminating threats, and Sarah's hospital was now part of the battlefield where that elimination was taking place. Patricia, I want you to activate Code Silver protocols immediately. No ambulance transports without federal security escort. No medical procedures without witness verification. No equipment maintenance without military oversight. Code Silver was a protocol Sarah had developed for protecting witnesses receiving medical care. But activating it hospital-wide meant acknowledging that Chicago General itself had become a target in a war most people didn't know was being fought. Colonel Harrison was listening to Sarah's conversation with growing concern. Dr. Mitchell, if the network has moved to active elimination of threats, then every witness, every investigator, and every medical professional who supported corruption investigations is now in immediate danger. Sarah looked at Elena Rodriguez, a young woman who had risked her life to expose crimes that most people couldn't imagine, and realized that the choice to help her meant accepting that normal life was no longer possible. Colonel, what are you recommending? Complete lockdown of all witnesses, military-level security for all medical facilities treating protected individuals, and immediate expansion of the investigation to include counterintelligence operations against what appears to be a sophisticated assassination network. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message, this one from David Chun. Dr. Mitchell, Melissa, and Hope are safe, but federal agents have identified credible threats against your hospital. The network Elena discovered has decided that everyone who helped expose Chicago corruption needs to be eliminated. Be careful. Sarah realized that the work she'd thought was about exposing corruption had actually been about uncovering a systematic method of murder that used medical care as a weapon. Elena's investigation hadn't just revealed financial crimes. It had exposed a network that turned hospitals and ambulances into instruments of assassination. Elena, Sarah said, checking her patient's vital signs once more, your investigation has uncovered something that goes far beyond corruption. You've found evidence of systematic murder using medical infrastructure as cover. Elena nodded, her strength returning as the effects of the poison began to diminish under medical treatment. Dr. Mitchell, what I found is proof that democracy itself is under attack. When people can't trust that ambulances will come when called. When hospitals become places where witnesses disappear. When medical emergencies become opportunities for assassination. That's not corruption anymore. That's terrorism. Sarah realized that Elena was right. What they were facing wasn't just criminal activity. It was systematic destruction of the infrastructure that kept society functioning. Emergency medical services that couldn't be trusted, hospitals that weren't safe, medical professionals who had to choose between saving lives and protecting themselves. Elena, what do we do now? Elena Rodriguez looked at Sarah with the same determination that had driven her to investigate corruption despite knowing the risks. Now we finish what Melissa Chun started. We expose the entire network, we document every crime, and we prove that individual courage can still defeat institutional evil. But as alarms began sounding throughout Walter Reed Medical Center, indicating that the facility was under some form of attack, Sarah realized that finishing the investigation might require surviving challenges that none of them had anticipated. War between truth and corruption was about to escalate to a level where medical professionals would have to choose between treating patients and defending democracy itself. And the outcome would determine whether hospitals remained places of healing or became battlegrounds in a conflict that most Americans didn't yet know was being fought. The alarms at Walter Reed Medical Center turned out to be a false alarm. A security drill that had coincidentally occurred during the most tense moment of Elena's recovery. But the timing served as a reminder of how precarious their situation had become, and how quickly everything could change. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching as President Catherine Walsh signed the Emergency Medical Services Integrity Act into law. The legislation, which had grown directly from Elena Rodriguez's investigation, established federal oversight of emergency medical services, mandatory security protocols for witness protection, and criminal penalties for using medical infrastructure to harm protected individuals. Elena stood beside Sarah, no longer the frightened young reporter who had called from a payphone at Union Station, but now the Director of Medical Infrastructure Security for the Department of Homeland Security. Her investigation had not only exposed the assassination network but had led to the creation of an entirely new federal agency dedicated to protecting the medical systems that Americans depended on for survival. The ceremony was attended by all the major figures whose lives had been changed by that Tuesday night when David Chun had walked into Chicago, general covered in blood. Detective Lieutenant Sullivan was there, now heading a national task force on corruption in emergency services. Deputy Director Morrison, promoted again to lead the FBI's new Medical Security Division. David Chun, out of witness protection, and working as a federal consultant on infrastructure security. And Melissa Chun, holding 2-year-old Hope in her arms, serving as the administration's special advisor on whistleblower protection. President Walsh's remarks captured the significance of what had begun as a single doctor's decision to trust a desperate stranger. The legislation I'm signing today proves that individual courage can reshape entire systems. When Dr. Sarah Mitchell chose to leave her hospital to save a federal witness, she didn't just save one life. She saved the integrity of emergency medical care for millions of Americans. But the real victory wasn't the legislation or the ceremonies or the federal appointments. The real victory was measured in statistics that most people would never see. Emergency response times in major cities had improved by an average of 3 minutes since the assassination network had been dismantled. Equipment failure rates during critical medical emergencies had dropped to statistically normal levels. The number of federal witnesses who died during medical emergencies had fallen to 0 over the past 18 months. People were living who would have died if the corruption network had continued operating. Families were intact who would have been destroyed by medical assassinations disguised as accidents. Democracy was functioning the way it was supposed to, with accountability enforced by citizens brave enough to demand the truth. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in conversation with President Walsh, who had specifically requested to meet the doctor whose split-second decision had catalyzed everything that followed. "Dr. Mitchell," the president said, I've read the classified reports about what you and your colleagues uncovered. The scope of the threat to our medical infrastructure was far beyond what anyone imagined. How did you find the courage to take that first step into the unknown?" Sarah thought about the question, remembering the moment when David Chun had warned her not to come closer, and her decision to trust him anyway. "Madam President," she said, "I think courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to do the right thing despite being afraid. When someone's life is in danger, when democracy itself is under attack, the only choice that matters is whether you're willing to risk everything to protect what's most important." President Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Mitchell, your actions that night didn't just save Melissa Chun's life. They saved the principle that truth and accountability can still triumph over corruption and violence. That's the foundation that democracy rests on." As the White House ceremony concluded and the various participants prepared to return to their transformed lives, Sarah reflected on how completely everything had changed since that Tuesday night. She was no longer just an emergency room doctor at Chicago General. She now served as the nation's first director of medical witness protection, overseeing a program that ensured anyone brave enough to expose corruption could receive medical care without fear of assassination. The work was challenging in ways she had never anticipated. Protecting witnesses meant understanding not just medicine but intelligence operations, counterterrorism, and the psychology of people who had risked everything to expose wrongdoing. But it was also the most meaningful work she had ever done. Elena Rodriguez approached her as they walked through the White House corridors toward the exit. "Dr. Mitchell, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Do you ever regret that night? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if David Chun had never walked into your emergency room?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The past 2 years had been filled with threats, investigations, trials, and constant security concerns. Her quiet life as an emergency room doctor had been replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. "Elena," she said finally, "I think about that night often, but not with regret. I think about how many people are alive today because of the choices we made. I think about how many future witnesses will be protected because of the systems we built. I think about how democracy is stronger because a few people chose truth over safety." Elena smiled. "That's what I hoped you'd say. Because there's another investigation I've been working on. Something that could be even bigger than what we uncovered about emergency medical services." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that had become the defining emotion of her new life. "What kind of investigation?" "Educational. Infrastructure. Schools, universities, research institutions. Evidence suggests that the same network we dismantled has been systematically corrupting educational systems to prevent the kind of investigation that originally exposed them." Sarah realized that the work they had started would never truly be finished. Corruption was like a disease that constantly evolved new forms, requiring constant vigilance and continued courage from people willing to expose it. "Elena," she said, "you know what this means. If we pursue this investigation, if we expose corruption in educational infrastructure, we'll be targeted again. The people we put in prison have associates who would love to eliminate everyone responsible for destroying their network." "I know," Elena replied. "But Dr. Mitchell, we've proven that individual courage can triumph over institutional corruption. We've proven that truth is stronger than violence. We've proven that democracy works when citizens are brave enough to make it work." As they walked out of the White House together, Sarah thought about David Chun's prophetic words from that night. When everything had changed, his next step had indeed changed both of their lives forever. But it had also changed the lives of countless people they would never meet. People whose medical emergencies would be handled by honest professionals using properly maintained equipment. People whose investigations into wrongdoing would be protected by systems designed to value truth over convenience. 6 months later, Sarah received a call that brought the story full circle. The voice on the phone was young, frightened, and determined, exactly like Melissa Chun and Elena Rodriguez had been. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Marcus Thompson. I'm a graduate student at Northwestern, and I think I've discovered something about educational contract corruption that people are willing to kill to hide. I need help." Sarah smiled as she reached for her emergency medical bag, now permanently equipped with everything needed to treat witnesses whose courage had made them targets. The work continued because democracy required constant maintenance by people willing to risk everything to keep it functioning. "Marcus," she said, "stay exactly where you are. Help is on the way." As she prepared to begin another investigation that would undoubtedly transform lives and challenge corrupt systems, Sarah realized that David Chun's warning had been more than prophetic, it had been transformational. "Don't come any closer," Melissa had said when she was hiding in that basement, bleeding and afraid. But Sarah had come closer anyway. Elena had come closer. Detective Sullivan had come closer. Deputy Director Morrison had come closer. And because they had chosen proximity over safety, because they had chosen involvement over isolation, because they had chosen courage over comfort, democracy itself had been strengthened. The next step was always the most important one. And Sarah Mitchell, the doctor who had once thought her responsibility ended at hospital walls, was ready to take it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.